What's up, YouTube? Today I want to talk about making the most out of mastering your own tracks. So this is not a mastering tutorial, but I think in this day and age where so many producers are kind of forced to master their own stuff, for SoundCloud and uploading and sending to people and all sorts of stuff and sending to labels for demos and all sorts of stuff, it's pretty important to kind of know how to make the most of your mix so that you don't run into issues with self-mastering. I think a lot of the time producers kind of get into the habit of, we'll fix it in the master, or the engineer will fix it in the master. And then when it gets to that process, they kind of just slap something like Isotope or some sort of like automatic mastering tool onto the master channel. And, that kind of leads to certain problems, which I'm going to try outline in this video a little bit. So I want to go through what I think are the most important things to kind of like get through before mastering. And, when self-mastering your tracks, it's going to help make your life a lot easier when mastering, because essentially, what you'll just be controlling in the mastering process is that kind of final overall level. You want to get as much of the kind of dynamics and spectral balance down in the pre-master or the mix process. And that's kind of what I want to go through today. So anyway, let's dive in and have a look. So here I've got a project that I've been working on, and I've kind of got to the mix process, and I figured there's a couple of things here which I want to use as examples, and there's another couple of things which I may have kind of over accentuated just because they're kind of common examples that I find a lot of producers run into and that kind of thing. So just keep in mind, this is not like my final finished mix of my track by any stretch of the imagination, but I kind of want to get it a lot closer to that in this video, and I want to show you how I kind of analyze, or the kind of final step that I take to make sure everything is kind of in check before I kind of self-master the track. So I think the most important tool in this process is some sort of spectral analysis plugin, particularly something that allows you to kind of save the reference curve of a track that you might be referencing or something like that. So I kind of use this example in so many videos, and I've kind of showed you guys this plugin so many times. But for those who might not be familiar with this plugin, how it works is if you play an audio example, so let's say, for example, I'm going to play this track, and you can capture the spectral the spectral curve of the track to compare it to another track. So you see, you can just use that take button to kind of like grab a spectral image of the track that you're working on. So if we look at the spectral curve, without these kind of like reference curves imprinted, it kind of overall does look kind of balanced. But one thing to keep in mind is that, in my opinion, the perfect mix isn't just, square, like from 20 to 20, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. There are these kind of like dips in the frequency range, and I think for very specific reasons as well. Let me just enable these curves again, and then we can listen to the track and look at where these certain parts of the track are actually sticking out a little bit, and we can discuss why I think a mix sounds better with those certain ranges or frequency ranges reduced a little bit. Okay, so first and foremost, you may have noticed that there's this kind of like pokey, outy section over here in the upper mid-range from about 2 kilohertz to about 6 kilohertz. And you'll notice here, this I believe is an imprint of Asterix track. And you'll notice here that often, this is actually quite a common thing you'll notice if you reference tracks, that there's this kind of slight dip in that region. And I believe it's because the human ear is very sensitive to that region, because we're kind of in tune to listening out for these kind of like natural warning signs like screaming or a baby crying or something like that. It kind of like triggers this thing in our brain that, like I said, our ears are just very sensitive to that area. So you'll notice it's quite a common thing that in mixes, this area is maybe not as present as like the very higher range of like the percussions and that kind of thing. And in this track, there's that kind of very squelchy FM thing, which is very sharp in that region. And it's very, very present and audible in the mix. And it might not have been before, but I mean, when I play it again for you now, it's going to stick out. And then again here in the latter part of this example, that kind of formant lead that starts with this kind of filter on it, you'll notice there's a lot of it going on in the kind of like lower mids over here. And again, this is a very common thing, especially with dance music, is that this is kind of like dip in the lower mids, and that's giving more space for the kick and the bass to kind of really come through clean. If you have a lot of stuff in a very close frequency range, so like let's say for example, we've got this fundamental over here, and then let's say for example we've got a lot of stuff happening here, our ears are going to kind of start to mask everything that's happening around certain frequencies. This is actually a phenomenon that they kind of used as the basis for creating MP3. So for example, lower kilobit MP3s, the way it kind of works is that it masks specific frequency ranges, because it knows, like for example, if our ear is hearing this like fundamental, or if our ear is hearing this overtone nice and clear, we're most likely not going to be paying attention to this one. So the MP3 encoding algorithm kind of like reduces certain things. It reduces the amount of data in these kind of like chunks. And I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but yeah, it's a similar idea where if you have a lot of stuff in a very similar or very close frequency range, you're not going to hear those things very clearly. But here, what's going to happen is if we start to remove some of these elements or EQ out some of these elements in this range, our kick and bass is going to come through so much cleaner. And that kind of like low fundamental subtone is going to really punch through the mix. And you'll notice we've got a little bit of a smiley curve going on here, but there's still this kind of presence in the kind of like mid range. So the things to kind of bear in mind in this part, like I'm explaining, is to just keep in mind that kind of like 2 to 6K region and make sure there's not too much stuff happening over there. And then this kind of like 200 to 800 region, make sure there's not too much stuff happening over there. So obviously this depends on the dynamics of your track. You can't have the track starting at full and that kind of thing. So what I would say is go to the main part of your track and kind of work on the spectral balance a little bit there, and then start to like slowly work backwards a little bit. So now I've soloed the sound, and I can actually see, which sound is the offending sound here in terms of like which frequencies are poking through a little bit strong. And I'm noticing that there's actually a little bit of this kind of like lower mids in the sound as well. So let's pop open an EQ over here, and we can look at really fine-tuning the sound so that it fits into the mix here. But I guess now this is less about fitting it into the mix and more about kind of like finding which of those tones are poking out in that kind of like frequency range, there's that one particular frequency which is coming through like very, very strong. So I'm going to try sweep a frequency, sweep a node on the EQ to try figure out which frequency that is that's kind of doing that squelch. Okay, so I think we've dealt with that kind of like upper frequency, the warning signal frequency range. Let's have a look at what's happening here. So this is something that I've noticed a lot. Is often you'll get with producers is you often have these kind of like atmospheric things happening here in the lower end, and because there's kind of like these stereo things in these atmospheres, it often starts to smear the lower mid-range a little bit, and you don't really get that punchy clarity coming through from the kick and bass. So this one obviously accentuated for the example here, but as you can see here, this channel has a lot of low end coming through. What I actually want to do is let's skip it to this part here where it's a lot more audible. I think we've got these atmospheres and things happening as well here. See, when we remove that sound, we get this like so much more power coming through because we don't have those sounds kind of like masking what we're hearing in that lower end. But we obviously don't want to remove sounds because it's a nice sound. I want to keep it in there. So let's just go ahead and I'm going to remove how I kind of like boosted this, maybe just reduce it a little bit instead. I'm not sure if you guys are noticing this as well, is as soon as I started reducing that low end in the synth, suddenly the snare pops out of nowhere. I'm not sure if it's the same, with monitoring setups and stuff, is you don't often have this exact same kind of like response and stuff, and especially with the transients and stuff, things can start to change a little bit. But, in my studio, suddenly those snares popped out and I started to hear, okay, those snares now need a bit of work and that kind of thing. So, again, this is kind of a reminder of why you can't really fix these things in the master, because anything that you do will adjust the overall spectral content of your track and start to mess with things which you might not be hearing, and all sorts of kind of compounding issues that, that kind of avalanche into something much more terrifying than it could be with just maybe 30 minutes to an hour's of work before going on to the mastering process. I'm noticing a similar thing now with this atmospheres channel here. It's starting to pop out a lot more because now there's kind of space. Our ears aren't masking those frequencies anymore, so that the other stuff in that frequency range is becoming a lot more apparent. So let's have a look at what's going on here. And again, a lot of low end. This one, again, purposefully boosted, but I probably would have forgotten about it if I weren't just going over it a little bit now. And these are things that can often get forgotten about. When we're being creative, we boost things, we cut things, and sometimes we forget about what we're doing and we go get a cup of coffee and things happen and we come back to it and it's completely thrown everything in the track off a little bit. So let's reduce this a little bit. I think I even boosted the volume here. So let's just play around here with the balance of this section. So that whole meme or joke or whatever about why your snare sucks so much. Imagine this. Imagine it's because it was just being masked by all the other stuff in your track and you weren't actually hearing what it actually sounded like in the mix. So let's dive into the snare and have a look at a couple of things here. So the next thing I want to talk about is kind of more of a dynamics thing. I want to talk about how a lot of the time certain things go unnoticed in the mixing process, and how to accentuate those, what's kind of happening in the mastering process so that you can kind of really hear how it could negatively affect your track. So for example, I'm going to load Elephant onto my master bus of this track, and here what I want to show you guys is the extent to which mastering a maybe subpar mix can really do more damage than just leaving it kind of as is, and how to use that to really analyze what's going on. So here, what we've got this eval setting. What this does is it basically gain matches the input to the output. So no matter what we do here, it's not going to boost the volume. It's not going to master the track. It's just going to kind of show us what the mastering is doing to the track. So let me just initialize this, and we're going to leave this eval setting on, and I'm going to boost this and just listen to what's happening here. It might be a little bit more apparent if we just pop the graph up so you can actually see and hear what's going on. So obviously that was overdoing it, but like I said, did you notice what was happening there? Every time that kind of snare was hitting, it was choking everything else in the mix. So you kind of just heard snare. And then every time that kind of really sharp synth hit, it was the only thing that you were hearing is just that really sharp synth. And in something like a modern dance music track, the snare and the sharp, like, transient synth are not the most important parts of your track. It's the kick and the bass. Those are the things that you kind of want to be triggering this threshold the most throughout your track. We can use this plugin to kind of accentuate what's happening here and look at the graph and kind of see, okay, it's the snare, and okay, it's that sharp lead, and you can kind of see what sounds are triggering the threshold and fine tune those so that the threshold triggering is not as apparent. I hope I'm making sense. So what I'm going to do here is let's pop open this graph, and we can just make it a little bit smaller actually. We can move this to the side here, and we can have a look at this snare. Do you see how much that snare, or how much more that snare is triggering the threshold than even the kick? So that means every time the kick is playing, it's kind of choking out, or this is, after the mastering of the track. Every time that snare is playing, it's kind of choking out the kick drum, which is actually the most important part of the track. So let's dive into the snare and process it in a few different ways. So check this out. Notice that the snare's got this kind of really doof, kind of like lower mid-range sound here. If you remove that lump kind of completely, you lose a little bit of the kind of liveliness of the snare drum. Check this out. But if you cut just next to it, we're kind of using that whole masking idea again. You kind of retain that low punchiness, but you're removing some of the other stuff so that that frequency range is not so full, if that makes sense. Okay, so we're almost there using just the EQs, but this is the most important thing in my opinion, is the kind of dynamics processing of the snare drum. So because in psytrance the snares, or your main snare is almost always layered over your kick drum. So you've got like the kick and then a kick and a snare, and then a kick and then a kick and a snare. Because it's almost always layered over the kick drum, you actually don't need this kind of really, this first kind of transient over here. Because it's so quick, your ear is kind of like masking that, and you're only really hearing that punchiness of the kick. And because the kick is the most important part, we can kind of use this to our advantage by fading this in a little bit so that the snare is not actually triggering the threshold of the mastering limiters and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay, so I've got to the point where I think I can push it as far as it's going to go without, losing too much volume or punchiness from that snare. But it's still poking through a little bit, and, I want to show you a really nice and easy way of dealing with this. So if we go over to our percussions group over here, there's various ways we can kind of deal with, limiting those peaks that are coming through from the percussions group into the master channel. And one of my favorite ways of doing this, particularly with percussion, is using a thing called a clipper. So Vox & Go Elephant has got a clipper mode built in, and you can use that if you want. But just because, some people might be watching this that don't particularly have that plugin, I'm going to use a plugin called FreeClip, which is free. Here, the idea of what a clipper is that essentially just, you set the ceiling for your audio. So let's say, for example, you've got a wave here, and it just limits that and just hard limits, doesn't let anything beyond that through. And this is a nice way, particularly for percussion, when they're not such a kind of like important part of the track, but you still want to retain some of this punchy liveliness of the percussions without too much like dynamics processing. Clipping is a really nice way of kind of doing this, because it kind of introduces its own kind of like vibe. But it kind of like gives you the ability to kind of get a lot more volume out of something, but retaining a kind of overall peak that's a lot kind of softer. I'm not sure if I'm explaining this correctly, but I found one of the best things, best modes here is like quintic or cubic, and then we'll just play around with some of these settings to kind of like find where this stuff is peaking. I see here it's like -6 or so, so we can just tweak this to what we think sounds the best. if you find that it's affecting your kind of like overall percussions too much, you can jump in and just clip the snare channel as well. That's also a possibility. Okay, so I'm feeding the snares through this kind of like decapitator group, and I've noticed that this is kind of like the snare in this is punching through a little bit too much on the transient as well. So what I want to do here is I want to put LFO tool, and then we can set it to 1/2, and then we can create a dip just over here where the snare hits. So you see we've shaved off 3 dBs there, but we've still got kind of like a very similar amount of volume coming through from the sound. Cool, that's sounding nice. And generally speaking, if you can get about 6 to 7 or more kind of dBs of gain here without too much gain reduction on the graph happening here, with very minimal, like with this amount here, then I reckon you're generally good with mastering. So yeah, I mean, it sounds pretty good to me. What do you guys think? Awesome, sounding good, nice and punchy. So then mastering is simply a process of disabling this. And now what happens is, instead of gain matching it, so making sure that the output is the same as the input, it doesn't gain match it, and it makes sure that the output is 0. So it kind of acts as a maximizer rather than a limiter. So this is going to be the same volume because I did have like a mastering plugin in my post setup. So, but just so that you guys can kind of get a reference of what it sounds like, you know, as is, what it would sound like in your example. Okay, so it's brought out a couple of other things within the entire track that I think I want to work on a little bit here. But, you know, just so you guys get the reference, I'm going to leave it at that for today. The TLDR of it, for those who skipped through, is don't focus on self-mastering your track. Use the idea of mastering to kind of outline what's wrong with the mix of the track, and then go back and fix that actually in the mix. Try leave as little processing for yourself in the mastering as possible. You know, if you think it needs a little bit more low end, specifically go into those parts and fix that with EQs and that kind of thing, or, you know, try fix the wideness or certain things within the mix. Anything that you try accentuate in the master is just going to like meddle with other things, and yeah, it's generally going to compound issues in the mix. So yeah, with just a little bit of thought and process and going through the track a little bit, you can definitely work out a lot of these kinks beforehand to make your life a lot easier in the mastering. But also then when you decide to send this to a mastering engineer, they're going to be able to get the most out of the track, because they're not going to have certain things that are maybe masked by other things. You know, the snare is going to be what the snare is supposed to be, and they're not going to have to fix things before adding their own kind of like character and stuff to the master. Awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, if you haven't yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button, and yeah, hit that like button. See you guys next time. Cheers.